how do you use the different facets of your background to ultimately perform pretty well at predictions and forecasting?
I think that there are probably three things to me that seem really important. One, thinking creatively, right? You don't want to do what everyone else is doing, even if what they're doing is fine and very effective, um, especially if you're doing prediction markets, because you want to break from the conventional wisdom, right? Your goal is to see where other people are wrong, what angle they're missing, right? I was talking to someone else that does forecasting, and they found recently, for example, that age is an incredibly useful predictor to find which challengers in the house are going to over or underperform. I'm trying to squeeze enough time to potentially add that to my model in the closing weeks because I have a few years worth of data to test it on now. Um, right? So it's like that type of original thinking will make you do better. For me, for example, like this is less relevant now, but I did candidate quality back in the primaries, right? I had a primary model that said like Mastriano is this likely to win. He's never run for office, or no, he hasn't run. He's running as state senator. I'm sorry. He has no fundraising. He's seen as pretty extreme. This is a guy who's likely to underperform if he wins the nomination. So I was lower on Republicans in Pennsylvania, and that's kind of how it's played out, for example. So yeah, creative thinking is huge. I would say the second is diligence. It is not necessarily fun to test your data on past election cycles, but you got to do it if you want to get it right, right? It is really easy to just try it on 2020, but that's actually setting you up for failure way more than a normal approach because unless we have a historic polling miss, using 2020 is going to be wrong, right? That's like using 1990 or 1948 as your system when Harry Truman was wildly underrated by the polls, and 4 years later, Eisenhower was rated by the polls in the same way, right? Like you have the famous Dewey beat Truman newspaper where Truman had won the presidential election. The poll said he was going to lose by so much that a newspaper published their headline anyway, just assuming he was going to lose. And Truman's holding up in his reelection celebration party. And the next year, the last poll we had, like Gallup, showed Eisenhower only winning by 3. Eisenhower actually won by double digits, right? Like you can just mess yourself up when you're using a year where everything went wrong. So try it on past cycles. 2020 should be part of it. You should increase the chance that you're wrong in the uncertainty of your models because of past misses, but don't assume it's going to happen. Otherwise, you're going to look really bad. And if you're betting money, you're going to lose a lot of money if you get a little bit unlucky. Then the third thing I would say that's critically important is be humble. You are going to get things wrong, and you need to assume that and attack your assumptions relentlessly. And like think about if I'm wrong, what is the number one reason that I'm wrong, and try to break down from there and see if you can do anything that will improve your assessments as a result.
Well, what is the number one thing, if there is one, where you tend to err?
I would say that I had too little uncertainty last time. Ironically, despite what I was saying, I think I thought 2016 was too much of a aberration, and I wanted to go. I bended my results too much to fit history, and that is the downside of testing in the past. Is your goal here is not to predict past elections. That's what I did in 2020, essentially, right? And that did help me fine tune some things in terms of getting my projection closer, but it made me give like way too high odds to certain situations that were not realistic. And now I think I've learned that look, we can't predict things perfectly within every data point, right, to know exactly how voters are going to go forward. But we have to sometimes call some audibles and take some risk because it's not going to always perfectly align with the past, and politics does change. Its base history will give you a great understanding of what's happening in the future, but history doesn't repeat itself perfectly.
Do you? Go ahead, Pratik.
Oh, if I were to say where I tend to get things wrong and answer that question, I would say at least historically it has probably come from putting too much weight on polling. Now, I am sufficiently satisfied from the last couple election cycles that I think Robert Cahaly is correct, at least in the sense that old methodologies of polling need to take a harder look, and even if they don't fail all the time, there are certainly cases where they fail. I guess the way that I'm dealing with that is that I'm taking qualitative factors a bit more seriously, and I'm also just allowing for a bit more variation. But can you talk generally on the topic of how should we think about polling? Like, should we view it as just one barometer now that is a little bit less accurate, or do you think that pollsters are genuinely learning and figuring out what went wrong, or how do you think about that question?
Yeah, I think that pollsters need to get better because it's their business model and they're likely to improve as a result. I think a healthy dose of skepticism is absolutely essential these days with pollsters, but they're still the best metric we have in my view. If you're just going to use one, maybe that and partisan lean combined, how state votes relative to the national vote. So like if, you look at Biden, if it's a +8 Biden state and Biden won by 4 nationally, okay, you treat that as like a +4. Not that you only use 1 year to determine partisan lean, but that's kind of the basis of it, right? So I would say those two combined give you a good read on what's going to happen. I think it's pretty clear that JD Vance and Tim Ryan is going to be a lot closer than the House vote in Ohio will be, or the governor, right? And I think the polling is enough to bet on. We just don't know if it's going to miss and how much. I'd say chances are Ohio's going to miss to the right, but I wouldn't count Ryan out completely, for example. But the thing on Cahaley that makes me very confused, though, is his polling just seems way all over the place when it comes to being away from what all the other metrics would suggest. Every time he seems to be in a safe Democratic state, like in New York, and we get like a +R7 or a +D7 poll or D5, and then we have Pennsylvania where that seems a little more realistic, where it's like D2, or like Nevada where it's like R+2, R+3. I just don't understand how in these safe D states he's getting these numbers where they're 15 points off from what we would expect if we didn't have any polling. And that's made me a little bit skeptical to wonder if maybe, he is clearly a little bit more on the partisan side, the way he talks about things and tweets. I'm wondering if he wants people to invest in these candidates that he likes more. Now, I'm not putting that in my model because he had a good record in 2020 and 2016, even if it was bad in 18. And so I am giving him the benefit of the doubt. But just on a personal level, he's raised my skepticism because of those safety poll states. Just seem wild to me, consistently wild.